Please welcome Dave to the S4 main stage.
All right, so first of all, thank you, Dale, and everyone else for coming to see me. Not that I can see you because of the way these lights work. I want to talk a little bit about Cyberwar. I want to talk about where we're going wrong and how to change that. So a quick overview of this talk is I'm going to talk a lot, probably more than you want, about some policy issues we've been having. I'm going to talk a little bit about Immunity's, I'm not going to call it proprietary, but special way of thinking about Cyberwar and how we've used it. I'm going to make some predictions, which you'll all hate, and then I'm going to have some ideas in theory. So in case that very weird bio that I'm sure we sent you didn't make a whole lot of sense, when people ask who I am, what they find out is that I kind of know some things, but I write trolly things on the internet, which is a little bit what this talk is. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a game that I play. All right, just to try it, raise your hand if you've played Overwatch or League of Legends. All right, so not as many as I'd hoped, but the rest of you are going to learn a lot about Overwatch. So, and what I learned was that I was really bad at it. Like, I thought because I grew up with video games like Doom and all the others that I would be able to play Overwatch, which is a first-person shooter. But modern games are all kind of the same. They all are like team composition games. They tend to have roles like tank or healer or DPS, which is your damage dealer. And so you can see a little screenshot here of what some of the characters look like and what they do. The maps are always very dynamic. And what I tried to do was look at some of these games and use those to provide a better model for how we're doing Cyberwar. Because if you listen to how most people try to explain Cyberwar, they're using very simplistic game theory, or they're borrowing theories from the nuclear stuff, which frankly does not map well into Cyberwar. And so what I'm trying to say is, look, there's a phase change between your simplistic game theories and the theories that we use to play actual games. And so if you look at some of the ways you talk about what they call the metagame of Overwatch, is that, every so often the developers release a patch, and that changes the way the game functions by making one character stronger, one character weaker, a map gets fixed, and then everyone has to quickly adapt and adjust to figure out what team composition and strategies work in what they call the new meta. And we don't do that in cyber. We don't have that level of analysis, but we do have sort of strategic metagame styles. So if you look at, like, if you have something like TAO, right? You would look at that and you'd say, well, you have this kind of thing where you have a giant operator mega team, right? And my little table here will kind of show you what we think of that. Or you can look at the way other countries do it. You're like, you have a lot of outsourced small teams all doing their own thing, and then we try to coordinate the results after you bring them in like a fusion center, perhaps, we might call that. You look at some people who have been deploying remote worms as a strategy, or who have fully automated suites. So you can look at these strategies and you can say, some of these strategies are going to be better than other strategies in the current Cyberwar meta, but which ones and why? How do we build this analysis so we can predict further down the road what's going to be better? And then you also ask yourself, we hear a lot of things about a lot of things from the policy world, but yet here we are at S4 and Infiltrate and other conferences, and they're all very small. And it's sort of like, why are we still here is an important question, like still able to do this business. And if you watch or read the policy papers, which I've been doing obsessively for the past 3 years, you'll see people like Jim Lewis, who's at CSIS, and like probably the most respected organization in cyber policy, talking about how states are the only actors really that matter when it comes to cyber war, and that non-state actors just lack the tools to do strategic effect. Frankly, I think pretty much everything that you see from these people is wrong. And I think it's wrong for an interesting reason. We're going to talk about why. Last year, the UNGGE, a big group of nations who all thought they were going to come to one happy agreement on cyber war and making norms and progress, it completely failed in a very predictable way. And everyone pretended to be super surprised at the State Department before they all got fired. So The reason they failed, first of all, it's because the people in charge are watching sci-fi movies instead of reading sci-fi books, which I find hilarious. Here's my summation. If you haven't read Cryptonomicon, you cannot be a cyber policy expert. It's just weird. And there's probably a few in this room. All right, so they're not you guys. But like, you're going to come up and you'll be like, how do you even know? Okay, so anyway, where do they get all this understanding? And they get it from two places. They get it from academia, and they get it from the legal community. And by legal community, I mean the international law community, essentially, but also just random lawyers that we've had as like head of counsel in various agencies. And the end result is catastrophic failure is really the only way to talk about it. And the Wassenaar arrangement used to be a very useful arms control arrangement that even Russia's part of. You'll notice China's not part of it. But a lot of nations take the agreements that you make up and they incorporate it into their own law. And if you've ever looked at export control law, you may notice that it's probably the single worst law on our books. Many parts of it make no sense in any modern time. So I ended up having to join the ICETAC, which is the Commerce Department Technical Advisory Board that talks about Wassenaar. In fact, our meeting is next week. So if you want to hang out with the Commerce Department, come join us. I'm going to be teaching an introduction to SQL injection. That's where we're at. So they're just giving you a picture. So like, here's things like, you know, modern like Moore's law, all these things, they regulate them on floating point operations per second. A lot of that stuff does not make sense in the modern world. When you try to define, like you can't define software the way you define missile parts, that doesn't really correlate, but they want it to correlate, so they pretend it does. And dual use and Turing machines are a very weird concept because by definition, Turing machines are all use. And so after dealing with the policy world for many, many years, 3 years, but it felt like forever, you find vulnerability classes, the same way we talk about buffer overflows and authentication issues. You find certain things where you know when you get a piece of policy coming down the pipe, you can say one of these three things, and you'll know that they have a gap, and they won't know how to handle it. And I learned this from Microsoft, actually, who's been very astute in this area. So every time a new policy piece comes down, they say, oh, how does that work in the cloud? Right? And then the policy person has to go like chew on that until they give up and get, retire. It's great. And here's what we've learned, though, is that like they assume that code has a built-in intent. They assume that somehow you've distilled your intent into the software, and that's just how it works. And that's not how software works. And they also assume both that data and execution have a physical locus, right? So they don't understand that, in fact, the whole point of a Turing machine is it doesn't really operate in physical space. But they refuse to admit it. And you'll see Jim Lewis in particular. There's like a deep-set denial in all of these organizations. And I'm going to go into a little bit of this. I'm going to pick on some people because they can take it, but also because they're super wrong. And so there was a paper that came out recently, which came out, and you could tell the way it was written. This is from the Belfer Institute, which is pretty prestigious, but terrible, and does terrible work in this area. It's weird. Here's an example. They were like, we're going to take all the vulnerabilities and try to find out if two people often find vulnerabilities that are the same in the same product at the same time, so the vulnerability collisions. And they came up with a rediscovery rate in the little table of something like 13% for Chrome, which is like a ridiculous number. That's like if you were saying, oh, it's a cold day today, so clearly it's getting colder on Earth and not warmer. Right? So everyone in the industry was like, where are these people coming from? But clearly they'd never really asked a vulnerability specialist. The other thing was they completely forgot how fuzzers work, how bug tracking systems work, and frankly, they didn't care. It was obvious from the paper that they didn't care, and they were pushing a political agenda. So I did a 5-minute review of their paper. Actually, it took a couple hours. And to their credit, they put all their data up on GitHub. And I downloaded it, and I looked at it, and it was basically fake. And so I told them that. 2 weeks later, they were like, you know what? You're not wrong about one small piece of the data, but our conclusions remain largely unchanged. And this is before they went back to relook at the data. So I find it fascinating that they would write a paper with bogus data, release it, learn that it's bogus data, and still have jobs, first of all, But second of all, not change their conclusion. Not be like, hey, there's nothing we can do about that. So a lot of the stuff you're seeing from the policy world is of that quality, and that feeds right into our policy making at the national strategic level. And the issue is, the reason they're even listened to is because this is what the nuclear team looked like, right? They're all, you can't read it down there, but they're all professors. And they all wear nice suits, and they all have, this is what they are. And then this is what your cyber team looks like, right? These are your thought leaders. I mean, they look cool to me, I guess. Many of you probably know who these people are. And if not, I'll give you a little layout of them later. I mean, you should be getting your strategic cyber policy advice from this team, right? Yes, but in fact you should. But all the previous generations of terrible things that happened to us came from academia, basically. And so that's just not, it's not an applicable strategy for feeding our policy arms anymore. So, good data is the issue. We need good data. We need data-driven policy development. We don't have it. And I want to talk a little bit about international arrangements in terms of NATO. Some of you recognize the TF2 spy. Invariably, you will see the same bug classes within any of these large international alliances that you see within local groups. It's sort of fractally broken, right? Between two countries, we can't agree on stuff. Inside the country, we can't agree on stuff. And even inside particular agencies within our country, we don't agree on the same stuff. And so it's literally you're dropping a random ball down that little pegboard to get a policy result. So NATO came out with the Tallinn documents. They are terrible. No one wants to admit they're terrible. They can't agree on anything. The second one is like reading the Talmud, right? It's like it's surrounded by commentary from various experts, and they don't seem to think that's a problem. So the first bug they have is in the very first page, you're like, well, nations have sovereign territory, and cyberspace is just part of that. And the other one they have is, anytime you have to replace a hard drive, it's a physical attack. That's cyberwar then. If you don't, then it's not, right? And we can see how this does not correlate with the world we live in. And yet, they don't seem to mind. So they're all geniuses. Like when you talk to them, they're super geniuses. They just are super wrong at the same time. And it's sort of weird that we haven't sort of immunosystemed them out yet. Okay, so I talk about why, I try to explain this to them. And I'm terrible at explaining why data does not have a locality. And then I try to explain it by saying quantum mechanics is very similar. And this apparently is a bad choice of direction for analogies. But the same thing is true with electrons, right? They're not dots, right? Even in this picture, they're dots. But an electron's not in some random place and you're maybe going to find it with a probability. The electron is the probability cloud. It is that. It's the whole cloud at the same time. It's not in a particular place. And I try to explain this to lawyers, and they don't understand me. So what's the result of all this? How do I diagnose it, right? So what I like to say is, well, let's look at where you are and how we know hackback is not happening. First of all, it's illegal. Second of all, you have a high chance of getting caught because defensive systems are so good. Thirdly, we would never do discriminatory prosecution. You don't have the ability to get the offensive talent you need, and nation states already provide you a perfect protective umbrella for all of your needs. Except none of those things are true, and so we know for sure hackback is happening. And that's where we have these massive policy gaps. So, to end the policy portion, because I know some of you are hating policy, as I often do, we've just become used to policy paralysis. And until we find a way to get people at the national level who have technical backgrounds making the policy, then we're going to continue having it. So let's talk about how you project cyber power. Everyone wants to talk about cyber weapons. I like to think of them as power projection tools. And a lot of reason people like to talk about cyber projection tools is because they want to rank theirs against everyone else's, right? Like, the Grug thinks that's useless. He's probably right. It's still fun. So, and the reason I try to do the projections is because to build a decent implant takes 5 years. And people forget that, like, Triton took time to build, and there's a whole team behind it, collecting it, integrating it, and we build an implant. So we built this little chart, talk about some of the features that the top-end implants have. And one of them was automated deployment. People did not read the Flame and Gauss papers and see where they were going. Behavioral routing, people still think all routing must happen like Canvas or Metasploit, and that is just not how you do a modern implant. And then the way I get my intrusion defenses is by, and I'm not going to say Kaspersky here, but what I do is is Kaspersky here this year? Oh, cool. Hi, guys. So you do active penetrations against targets to get your warning. And then how do I do anonymous deconfliction? If two states that are allies both want to go into a place, have they worked out a protocol for figuring out we shouldn't knock the other person off that box? Now you can do these triangles to figure out, measure the area and measure how people feel about their lives. Policymakers love those. But what I try to do is, with the right kind of person, give them an analogy of strategy. So in all of these games, League of Legends, all these things, you're going to have something called a tank, which hopefully most of you have heard of. These are two. I play the one on the left. And there's different kinds of them. Some of them are mobile. They get in, they cause disruption, and they get out. Some of them try to keep space. You establish, and then you never leave. And this is what your implants do, right? So when you're building an implant, you have two options. One, have a lot of differentiated persistence mechanisms, use very few resources, use them in a weird way, be super creative, or be as low as possible, be on the ground. And what tanks you choose determines your entire operational capacity and strategy and the rest of your toolkit. So do I go in and come out and not leave a trace, or do I go in and always stay there and trickle out my data that I need? So, and the same thing's true on a defensive side, right? So I can either be in the kernel as a main tank, or I can counter dive. And the way you're looking at that is, am I threat hunting? That's a counter dive technique. Or am I playing core wars with something like CrowdStrike or some of those things? And where am I doing it? You should be doing it from the hypervisor, but we try not to tell people that too much. So, attack chains. People want to talk about them. They don't want to build them. They don't want to plan them out. You get something in Overwatch called a wombo combo. For example, if I have like Zarya's Graviton Bomb and then another attack that can, attack a group of people that are all collected together. The same thing's true in building offensive capabilities. So for example, if you have PHP web skills, or if you've invested in PHP static analysis tools and Linux locals, you have a capability that will allow you to own everything on the internet. You don't need more than that one capacity, right? So the same thing's true with a lot of other different synergistic tool chains. So there's no point in building BIOS implants and PHP web skills. It's kind of where you can also take this. And you will see non-state actors do this, which is starting to trickle in my head. And as you see this, you try to analyze, when I analyze any meta, and this is true in Overwatch too, is what is the survivability of that meta? What are the things that if they change, I will no longer be able to play that kind of game? And we looked at a lot of things and how they scale up. So we can project that what you do now at one box, you will do on the entire internet in the future. And people have forgotten that this is still true. Like even for something like SQL injection, people have forgotten you could just do the whole internet every day, which I think is funny. So people often look at the bugs. I think it's a mistake sometimes to look at the bugs, but when we talk about bugs being rare, the reality is bugs are not rare, but also bug classes are not rare. And I wrote a bunch of these down just so you could see that there's more than some. But the tricky thing is knowing that your adversaries use different bug classes than you use, and that most penetration testing companies have like C bug classes, like format string bugs, that you don't know about. Obviously, format string bugs you do know about. But knowing that there's something in .NET that you just don't know about should give you a sense of where your defenses need to be. And just because something's not rare doesn't mean it's cheap. So we're going to talk a little bit about the VEP later. All right, so prediction models, what do they predict? A model is useless if it doesn't predict something. Immunity's model predicted that worms would be the obvious offensive meta in play at the moment. And our implant is designed to be an autonomous agent if it needs to be. And if you look at it, the vast majority of all the cyber power projection tools we look for and we see are kind of maintained by non-state actors, which again was something that I thought was interesting, especially when the Kaspersky stuff started popping up. Hi, guys. Because they're actually quite funny. They're like, we feel bad for the 100% of NSA engineers who did not realize they were not working for the top APT. All right, good job, guys. So evolution happens in weird ways, and you know, I don't know whether Kaspersky did anything bad or not. I do know that one option is they did nothing, and we took them out behind the barn and shot them right in the head as a deterrent mechanism. And the other option is they did something, and we took them out behind the barn and shot them right in the head, which is also a deterrent mechanism. So I just don't know which thing we're deterring quite yet. I find it funny, and I want to talk about non-state actors, because what you'll hear is Jim Lewis and everybody in international law will say only state actors matter, sovereignties can control anything within their borders, borders are important, they will repeat it because they have cognitive dissonance to the nth degree, and they just cannot get over themselves. So what you see, though, is that the United States, the best team in the world, could not handle lulzsec for almost a year. And lulzsec's as low-end an actor as you can get. Likewise, we just arrested a Chinese agent for giving up all of our, one of our agents, for giving up all of our Chinese agents. I guess he was also a Chinese agent. Complex. But I mean, if you went to Google and you said, hey, guys, go find every American spy in China, they probably could. And that should scare you. And then private actors don't necessarily attack nation states. There's a lot of very vulnerable, shall we say, other private actors out there, right? If Sea Shepherd gets a hacker, what's going to happen to all those whaling companies in Norway? A lot. The talent question is very interesting because people assume that you can train tens of thousands of hackers, have them leave into private industry, and then not have a giant. It's like if we trained a bunch of special forces people in Afghanistan and had them come back and not get jobs, right? So what would that do to the talent pool? And you can see that, like, this is Doug Song's little video, or image, he put us in it. But people have forgotten where all this came from. Like, if you go to like a policy person and you say, who was TISO and why are they important and where are they now, right? Because right now they're setting national policies and building the products that we all use or doing other very interesting things. Like, who is WooWoo? Like, half the people on WooWoo are billionaires right now and build products and have a particular ethical set that is influencing nation-state strategies, and yet none of the, if you go talk to CSIS, none of them will know who we're talking about. So I do jiu-jitsu along with a lot of things, and it's very interesting because you can watch fighting get revolutionized before our eyes. And one of the things that's interesting about it is this idea that they have lineages. And hackers also have lineages, right? Like, this is the TISO group picture. The only reason I use pick on TISO is because they're kind of public. And so the kinds of vulnerabilities that they found are the ones that we have to worry about most now because they're still finding them, right? The lineages continue, right? Like, if I go and look at Scandinavia and I say, it's funny, you guys used to have a lot of very good assembly code. Does anyone remember the demo scene? Right? So they used to have a lot of very good assembly coders. I'm sure they're not doing anything interesting now, right? Like, surely not. If you look at Japan, right? Like, what are the kinds of vulnerabilities you think would come out of the Japanese scene? It's very easy to predict. It's easy to predict the types of implants and operational tools that they're going to build into the future, and also their value systems. So these are just value choices, really. And what you see is that the vast majority of the top-tier hackers in the world are either not now with nation states or really never were, right? People underestimate the outside. The inside is easy to see, the outside is hard. And I find that this fact has eluded our policy arm. And I like to pick on Jason Healy's paper a little bit because he draws a very clear dichotomy between offense and defense. And instead of using an offense versus defense thing, I like to talk about control versus uncontrol, right? So the classic example here is DNS. DNS is a broken protocol running on broken, everything about it is broken, and then DNSSEC is even more broken. And yet we don't want to replace it, even though we know that when you have worms like Mirai on every little camera, the one thing they can attack that will take everyone out is DNS. And yet we refuse to build a decentralized system, even though we could very easily. So I think these are the issues that if you want to actually improve the systematic weaknesses we have, sometimes you have to decide, I don't want to control DNS as a nation state anymore. And we haven't done it because we used our control of DNS for other equities issues, like copyright violation protection, stuff like that, that we think is more important. What you'll see in policy papers is they will always quote Jason Healy's, it's almost an off-the-cuff estimation of how many vulnerabilities a nation state would have. And then if you look at Lily Ablin's paper, which is from RAND, which was very good, I mean, she found someone with a bunch more vulnerabilities just all by themselves. So you have to be very, sourcing in the policy world is not like sourcing in our world. They sort of just will randomly quote bits of papers that they like. All right, so in general, what makes some of this offense versus defense stuff really hard is that cyber is a domain for flanking maneuver almost entirely. And so when everything is a flanking maneuver, it's very hard to discuss things in a defense-offense dichotomy. All right, so we reached sort of ideas, things you can do. I originally gave this talk before Twitter became so obviously important. But what you want to do is look at your society and see where the weak spots are in sense of what would I attack, as sort of red team exercise. I hope we're doing this, actually. But that's the sort of thing where you catch election hacking ahead of time. And you ask yourself important questions like, is Twitter a strategic target, right? Because if you can post things as Donald Trump, you can clearly do a lot of damage, even just temporarily. And you know, people sort of forget that now we seem to do our missile threat discussions on Twitter, which I find amazing, right? So you still have Jim Lewis on one side saying, Cyberwar doesn't work, there's no way this is going to cause any damage of any real kind, it's not strategic, who cares? And on the other hand, you have like the Hawaii Emergency Management System saying, hey, that missile threat wasn't real, sorry guys, right? Like, it's bizarre, right? Someone is wrong. I'm not going to say who's wrong, but it's Jim. And the way you do this, honestly, is by having better connection to your offensive teams. And it's not that hard, really. All you have to do is ask them, any penetration company in the world, doesn't have to be American, how much would it cost to run an op where you post something as Donald Trump on Twitter? Just cost it out for me. I just want to know. What's your chance of failure? What happens if you fail? What are the percentages? Cost it out like a real op. And again, supply chains are super important, right? Like, and the ICS world is rife with these issues, right? Like, I can buy, you know, like with real money, a lot of the things that then go into important things. And there's people doing this, obviously. But that's sort of the ultimate persistence mechanism, right? I don't have to build an implant or Trojan anything now. I just buy the company that's selling you all that stuff. And you could buy Twitter for just a few $1 billion. I think it'd be a good deal. So here's my conclusion. 1, we can do better. There's no reason to have people with no technical experience as cybersecurity coordinators or in positions where you even listen to them. Just don't listen to them. It's a good model. And in that, we could also build more complex, better predictor models from a technical power projection standpoint. And you have to, because you have to do everything 5 years ahead of time. And whether or not we succeed as a country is going to depend on our ability to do these things, is the truth. Because what cyberwar really attacks is ideologies. And ideologies are super weak. And ours are not as strong as we were hoping. So I leave you with this Barbie cartoon where she says, can anyone tell us what this is? Yes, it's a packet that causes buffer overflows. And the school database already says I got an A. And that's the approach we need from our cybersecurity policy. So that's all I have. Thank you so much for listening to me. And I leave you with that.